Good afternoon, everybody. Let me welcome you all to the IISS. My name is Dr. Andrew Chi, a research fellow here at the Institute. Today I'm honoured to have with us Dr. Govinda Clayton and Dr. Siri Rustad, who will be discussing their research on ceasefires. Govinda is a senior researcher with the Centre for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. His research focuses on negotiation and mediation during civil conflicts. He applies advanced quantitative methods to systematically assess the conditions that shape the outcome of third-party-led conflict management. He is Deputy Editor of the International Peacekeeping and the Executive Director of the British Conflict Research Society. Siri is a senior researcher with the Conditions of Violence and Peace Department at the Peace Research Institute, Oslo. She is the project lead for both the Ceasefires and Conflict Trends project at PRIO. Her research interests include the role of natural resources in conflicts and post-conflict societies. The topic of their talk is ceasefires and civil wars. This event is on the record, so I'll hand the floor over to them and then we will open for a Q&A session after.
Thanks a lot, Andrew, and thanks a lot for having us here. It's a real pleasure to be here with you all today. So thanks a lot for taking time out of your busy schedule to come and listen to us talk to you a little bit. So, as Andrew said, we're going to be talking today about ceasefires and civil war. And this is the kind of culmination of about 3 years of research up to this point, but we kind of view ourselves as about halfway through the project. So we're going to be presenting you where we're at now, but we're really interested to hear your feedbacks on what type of questions you're interested in so we can use that to steer what we do for the next 2 or 3 years. And so this project emerged as a conversation, first of all, between us at ETH Zurich and the mediation support team and the Swiss Foreign Ministry. So the UN began to prepare its guidance on effective ceasefires, and they turned to some of the experts in the Swiss Foreign Ministry, and they wanted some particular advice on a few relatively simple questions about ceasefires, how many there were, what types of characteristics they took, and things like this. So they turned to us at ETH and they said, well, can you provide us some simple answers to these questions from the research? So we went to the literature and we said, well, actually, no. The academic research can't really say very much about what we know about ceasefires at this point. And while we were kind of having this conversation, the Norwegian Foreign Ministry reached out to some of our colleagues in PRIO and asked effectively the same question. And they also turned to the research and found a similar finding. And so we then thought, well, this is a huge problem. We need to address this. And how can we best fill this gap in knowledge to kind of facilitate the work of both the Swiss and the Norwegian Foreign Ministry and also other international actors, and that's kind of how the project first began. And so since then, the project's covered a few different areas. So we're going to talk today quite a lot about the data that we've collected. But in addition to that, we've also been interviewing high-level mediators who've been involved in ceasefire mediation in various conflicts around the globe to find out a little bit more about what actually happens within each of these processes as well. And so we're going to touch on that a little bit as well for you. So we're going to try and talk for 20 or 25 minutes, so we've got plenty of time to answer your questions as well. So, in case you drop off or get bored of our communication at some point over the next 20 minutes, here's the 3 things that we really want you to kind of take from this discussion. So the first of which is that ceasefires are really a surprisingly common feature within intrastate conflict. And I say surprising, I mean it's surprising to us. Maybe it's not surprising to you, and if it's not surprising to you, then we'll be really interested to hear that. But for us, when we first began this project, when we first began collecting data on ceasefires, we thought it was going to take us maybe 6-8 months, and 3 years later we've just about finished. And so we've been really surprised at the diversity and the frequency with which we've observed these ceasefires. Secondly, and this is kind of tentatively because these haven't been kind of peer-reviewed findings, but from what we can see in the data, and it's what Siri's going to talk to you about in just a second, the relative frequency and form of ceasefires seems to be shifting over time. In particular, movements from the national to the local level and the type of issues that are being included in these types of agreements. So Siri's going to kind of map out these first 2 elements for you in just a second. And thirdly, and again it was something that was perhaps a little bit surprising to us, but maybe not to those of you that have been working in this area, ceasefires can come in really lots of different flavours, shapes and styles. So the forms in which ceasefires can take really varies a lot. And as a result, the way in which ceasefires are used can be very different, and they take on very different purposes at different points in the peace process. And I'm going to try and map that out for you towards the end of the presentation. And so this is just very quickly to say that Siri and I are kind of presenting this work, but this is absolutely the work of a huge number of people, at least 10 or 12 people in ETH, a number of people in PRIO and colleagues in Uppsala as well. So while we present these as our ideas, it should be seen as very much a kind of team effort. So now I'm going to pass it over to Siri, who's going to talk a little bit about the data before I come back to how this fits into a peace process.
Right, so I'm going to start showing you a graph of ceasefires in the Afghan conflict. And that's not because I'm an Afghan expert, but it actually shows quite nicely how the data is built up. So we have coded all conflicts in the UCDP Uppsala database, all armed conflicts, state-based conflicts from 1989 until 2018. And what we've done is to code each ceasefire, the date of it, not only the year but also the specific date, what type of ceasefire, is it within a peace process, like the black horizontal line, vertical lines, or is it humanitarian? Is it related to holidays? Is it related to elections? Secondly, we also have in the data set if this is an informal or formal arrangement. Is it written or not? We also have actors. Is it more than one actor involved? Sometimes we have ceasefires that is only declared by one actor, unitary ceasefires. Or we can have with 2 actors, or we could have with 3 actors, or we could have ceasefires where it's one actor declaring ceasefires towards several other actors, but they are not rectifying. Then we also trying to make this sort of. It doesn't work on the screen actually. This doesn't really help, does it? And also the black line on this graph indicates battle deaths from the UCDP data as well. So one of the things that we can do with this data is to look at whether we see an increase or decrease in violence after ceasefires. And just in this example from Afghanistan, we see that after a period here up until 2001, with quite a lot of negotiations and ceasefires, we do see that the intensity goes down. And then here we have a long period with no ceasefires. We have these not peace-related ceasefires, but it doesn't really seem that that affects the intensity as much. And then it has increased a lot. And now we're of course in a period in Afghanistan where they are trying to figure out how to declare a new ceasefire. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of the global level. So what does all these data collectively tell us? This indicates each year how many of the ongoing conflicts actually had a ceasefire for each year. For those of you who have seen a conflict graph based on the UCDP data might recognize this sort of shape where we have in the early 90s we have a peak of conflicts due to the end of the Cold War, and then we had a decrease in the mid-2000s. It was really peacefully. Then we have an increase, and then suddenly in 2014 we had a dramatic increase. And the reason why we see that increase is due to IS in getting involved in a lot of conflicts. In fact, about 1/3 of all the conflicts here in this period are related to IS. Now the dark color are conflicts that actually had a ceasefire in that specific year. And we see that it's about 1/3 of all ceasefires or 1/3 of all conflicts for each year had a ceasefire. What we see here in this period is that it goes down. While the number of conflicts increases, the number of ceasefire decreases. And that's interesting. Part of this is of course due to this IS. The fact that IS is involved in so many conflicts, and we do not really have a lot of ceasefires that are negotiated with IS. So that explains part of it. But still, there is a decrease compared to the share of conflicts. That is something that's interesting to look into later. And then we also, when we break this down on region, we also see there are sort of shifts in regions. This also, of course, relates to where the conflicts are. Then in the 90s, we see quite a lot in in Europe and also in Asia. In the early 2000s, we see an increase in Africa. And now at the end of in this period, we see quite a lot in the Middle East. And this is also where we see a lot of the conflicts. We don't see there's a decrease in ceasefires in Africa. That's also related to less conflict in Africa. But what we see from the conflict data is that there is actually an increase in conflict in African regions. We might expect that will increase. And then to something Govinda alluded to is sort of the geographical scope of the conflict. So in this of the ceasefire. So in the data we code whether the ceasefire includes the entire country, or if it's only for the conflict zone, or whether it's very localized. And what we see is that in the past, say, 8 or 9 years, there's been an increase in local ceasefires. And if I had shown you now also a graph of what we call non-state ceasefires in the UCDP data, which are non-state conflicts, which are conflicts between two non-state actors. You can see that there's a dramatic increase of these type of conflicts right around here. From 2011 until now, there's been a dramatic increase in that type of conflict. And then we also see this increase in local ceasefires, which do indicate that there is something going on with the type of conflicts that we do see around the world, and that's followed by what we see with ceasefires. And finally, I'm going to say a little bit about what we call purpose. As I've mentioned several times now, and Govinda as well, is that ceasefires are not always related to peace processes. There could be many reasons for having a ceasefire. As you can see, peace process is the majority. But in fact, you see for many years, more than half of the ceasefires that are declared do not relate directly to a peace process. They could be humanitarian, and we do see in the last 5-6 years there's been an increase in humanitarian ceasefires. So basically, we'll stop fighting for a number of days so you can get food into the population, or we could help people who are wounded. We also have a fairly big share of what is called holiday, which is basically we're not going to fight over Christmas or over it. In the Philippines, for example, there is a ceasefire every Christmas between the Communist Party and the Philippine government. And then there's a small share of elections, and then we have this big group of other. Yes.
Thanks a lot, Siri. So, just to kind of recap what Siri suggested, what we're seeing in terms of trends for the last few years is, first of all, like relatively less ceasefires, so ceasefires being less likely to occur within conflict, more likely to be humanitarian and local, so less likely to be related to the overall peace process. And so obviously what we want to do is explain why we see that trend happening as well. And so what we have done first of all is we've looked at all of the ceasefires that we found in our data, so around about 2,000 ceasefires between 1989 and 2018, and we've run some analysis. If anyone's interested in exactly what we did analysis-wise, please do ask in the questions, but just to give you the kind of broad strokes. First of all, what we find is exactly what you would expect. Ceasefires are more likely following periods of high intensity violence and following longer periods of conflict. So the longer the conflict goes on for, or the more people that are dying as a result of the conflict, the more likely we are to see parties entering into a ceasefire. In particular, when both sides tend to be suffering as a result of the conflict, which is kind of exactly what we would expect. Also interestingly, we see that ceasefires are quite likely to follow a change in leadership. So after an election or some kind of change in the leadership of the state, ceasefires are more likely to occur. However, perhaps more interestingly and relating to our findings that we've seen in terms of the changing trends in ceasefires, there's three other things that we find. So firstly, mediation seems to be really effective at producing ceasefires. So during periods of mediation, ceasefires are much more likely. And in other research, what we found and what others have also found is that in the last 4 or 5 years, mediation has become less and less adopted. And that relates potentially to the specific type of conflicts that we're seeing. And also, and kind of importantly, ceasefires are much less likely to occur under two conditions. Firstly, when there's been some type of external military intervention into the conflict. So when outside parties become involved in a conflict, the ceasefire becomes less likely. And in context with multiple armed actors. So either when the government relies on some kind of pro-government militia, or when the insurgency is fractured in various different ways. So when viewed through this kind of lens, it's perhaps clear why we're seeing the trends that we're seeing in ceasefires. Because if we think of conflicts like Yemen, Syria and the like, that are fragmented, involve external intervention, have struggled to get fully fledged mediation processes off, our finding that the ceasefires are less likely and are more likely to be focused at this kind of local level perhaps makes a little bit more sense. But this is looking at all ceasefires in general. So we kind of put everything in the pot to see what we can find. So this includes humanitarian ceasefires, peace process ceasefires, and the like. And so what we then want to do is be like, well, how and in what way do these different types of agreements relate to a peace process? So we spoke to various different mediators, in particular Julian Hottinger from the Swiss MFA, and more recently other people from the UN who've been involved in different processes. And we looked, well, how is the best way to cut up these ceasefires, to divide these ceasefires in relation to the role that they play within a peace process? And in the UN guidance on ceasefire mediation, they're going to look at 6 to 8 different types of ceasefires. But we decided we wanted to be a little bit more broad than that. So we came up with 3 broad categories of ceasefires. So the first of which is what we'd call cessation of hostility agreements. So this would be something like what we see occurring in Israel today. These are very often informal arrangements between the parties that don't involve any type of monitoring and verification. So there's no external or internal actor coming into the context in order to see whether the parties are doing what they said they were going to do. These are literally the parties saying they're going to stop fighting. Sometimes this can be a verbal arrangement, other times it can be on paper. As part of the project, we've also looked through the kind of 300 or so written ceasefire arrangements that are available through other sources. And so often these arrangements are between 1 and 2 pages. So this is the kind of most common and the broadest category. Secondly, we could look at ceasefires in terms of preliminary ceasefires. And this is a term that's often used by ceasefire mediators. And by preliminary ceasefires, we mean preliminary in that they're preparing the parties for an ultimate peace agreement. And so preliminary ceasefires also involve some claim that the parties are going to commit to stopping fighting, but they also include measures to monitor and verify the mission. So we could think about perhaps the ceasefires in Sudan as falling into this category. And finally, what we call definitive ceasefires. And definitive ceasefires come at the end of a process, and they often accompany a peace agreement. So in the Colombia process, for example, the cessation of hostilities and the preliminary ceasefires weren't used. Instead, a range of other confidence-building measures were used, and the parties instead entered directly into a definitive ceasefire, which came into effect at the point at which the peace agreement was signed. So we can think of these 3 different types of ceasefire arrangements. And this comes, as I say, very much from engagement with practice. So then what kind of roles might these different arrangements play? So again, from talking to people involved in these processes, we've managed to identify a range of different purposes and roles that these different types of arrangements play at different stages of the peace process. So with regards to cessation of hostility agreements, these type of arrangements are normally the first type of ceasefires that parties enter into at the beginning of a process. And this can be for a variety of different functions. It might be, first of all, to signal a peaceful intent. If you think, for example, in Afghanistan, the holiday ceasefire would have fallen into this category. It might also be to build trust between the parties or to reduce civilian suffering. But generally speaking, cessation of hostility agreements can also be those agreements that are more likely to be manipulated by the parties in order to gain from the break in the fight, so more devious intentions, for example. And from our analysis, so we've looked at these agreements and we've looked at how long they tended to stop the violence for, and these cessation of hostility agreements tend to stop violence for around about a month. So there's variation here. Some of them break down within a day, others go a little bit longer, but on average they break down within about a month. So these are very much short-term agreements, and they should only ever be considered as short-term agreements. They're not intending to stop the violence for any longer. Preliminary ceasefires, because they involve monitoring and verification, are attempting to do much more. These are the agreements that are attempting to de-link what's happening on the battlefield with what's going on in the political negotiations. So in the North-South Sudan process, the parties originally decided not to enter into a preliminary ceasefire. but the conflict continued while the parties were negotiating, and they were unable to negotiate in good faith because every day the situation on the battlefield was changing. And so after about 3 or 4 weeks, they then agreed to enter into a preliminary ceasefire to create the context in which the negotiations could occur. These preliminary agreements, because they're monitored and verified, often by external parties, are also a way in which the parties can demonstrate some kind of command and control capabilities. So when it's not clear if the other party is able to actually enter into later stages of a peace agreement, these agreements are a verified way in which the parties can do that. And finally, these types of agreements can be used to kind of test out the arrangements that might then be used in a peace agreement. So for example, a small localised area might be demilitarised and monitored to show how it's going to work in the country as a whole. And we find that these preliminary agreements tend to last for around about 120 days. Now this is interesting, again, some last longer. But so even formal, monitored, verified agreements don't last that long. And that's because ceasefires are not actually attempting to resolve the conflict. They're not peace agreements. So if something doesn't come after the ceasefire, then they're going to break down at some point. In particular, from the perspective of a non-state actor, violence is the way through which they assert their bargaining leverage. And so if the process doesn't progress into a later stage, it's unlikely that it's going to produce, it's unlikely it's going to stick in the long term. So it's really important we keep that in mind with regards to ceasefires. Whereas definitive agreements set out the steps by which the parties are going to transition from the state from war to peace, so often the disarmament and demobilisation procedures. And these agreements, there is a lot of variation again, but tend to last for at least a year. So once we get to the definitive arrangement, we're really talking about peace agreements, and there's something we need to think about a little bit differently. So then, just quickly then, like from this kind of work, what have we found about like why it is that ceasefires work or why it is that they don't work? And there's two kind of key things that we can get here, and probably it's intuitively what you would think as well. So the first of which is definitely something that like international actors can contribute to, which is why I think it's particularly interesting to us, is the agreement and the process design. So there is good and bad ceasefire arrangements. There are arrangements that work well, for example, like the Nuba Mountains arrangement in Sudan is an example of a particularly good ceasefire arrangement that had very clear monitoring and verification and was agreed with the parties in a very coherent and structured way, and form part of an ongoing negotiation process. And then there's bad ceasefire arrangements that aren't clear on what the terms are, that aren't clear on what violations are, and often aren't negotiating in a coherent way by the parties. So definitely a good ceasefire increases the a good ceasefire design and a good process increases the chance of it working. However, essentially, of course, it all comes down to political will. And so you can have the best designed ceasefire in the world that breaks down almost immediately. So for example, in Liberia there was a number of great ceasefires technically that the parties had no intention to stick by, so they broke down. And on the other side you can have terrible ceasefires that stick when there's a political will. But I think as an international community and as kind of the kind of peace building industry can still very much focus on this area to improving the quality of the process and the agreements, and that will likely increase the quality and the extent to which ceasefires stick. So if you're interested in looking at this more, we have a website. I can send the link to any of you if you're interested, but you can access this on your phone or on the internet. And with this you can actually look at our data, so you can select any country, any period, and any of the other variables that we've coded. We've only spoken about a few of them today, and then you could then look at how and in what way that influenced violence. So if you're interested in a particular country and you want to have a look into this, by all means have a look. And then in terms of how ceasefires relate to a process, we have a variety of different policy briefs and the like, so if you look on our website then you can check these out. And this one in particular again was very much a kind of collaboration with the Swiss Foreign Ministry. So just to kind of recap on what I said we were going to try and do in this presentation. So first of all, just to be clear, that ceasefires are really common. They're happening in at least a third of conflicts, and often frequently within those conflicts in which they occur. So that was kind of surprising for us, and maybe it is or isn't for you. And secondly, that we've seen a kind of shift. So we've seen a movement, which very much reflects what most of us would expect, away from national level peace processes, the kind of elite, like big man, is often a man, negotiation processes, to more localised ceasefires focusing on more humanitarian arrangements. And we said the reason why that is a movement in particular with regards to external intervention and fragmented non-state groups. And finally, the ceasefires do take lots of different characteristics. So Siri set out a few with regards to motivation, whether they're humanitarian, election related, and I've offered you another way of thinking in terms of cessation of hostility agreements, preliminary ceasefires and definitive arrangements. And hopefully I showed in some way that they're used at different points for different purposes. And that's us. Thank you very much.
So, I wonder if we could start by, I have two questions. I have several questions, but let me ask two. You talked about local conflicts or local ceasefires impacting local conflicts, but I guess the question is, what more do we know about these local ceasefires? Is it location specific? Is it based upon just the local dynamics? Is it local groups who are negotiating this, or is there some sort of third party person involved in this? And so the second question is, what makes the best ceasefire? Is it a combination of all of them? What sort of things did you find, or other things that you might think actually might be relevant to the forms of ceasefires that are needed to make things work?
So I can say something about the local ceasefires. So in the data set, it's the variable is basically coded, is it national wide, so does it encompass the entire country, or is it the conflict zone, or is it a specific area? That's what I said. For example, in Syria, most of the conflicts, most of the ceasefires says this counts for the entire country except for areas that IS controls. So that's the kind of level that's in the data set. But we have seen that there are a lot of these non-state ceasefires as well. We haven't coded them yet, but we hope to be able to do that. We coded some. And they seem to have a very different dynamic than regular ceasefires that you negotiate with the government. For example, in Yemen, we could see that the Houthi rebels would negotiate with ethnic groups as they were moving towards Sana'a, to try to sort of get territorial control. So it wasn't sort of a ceasefire in the sense that you would negotiate with the government, but it was sort of more tactical, strategic. But I think this is a really, really interesting issue that we need to get more into, but we need to get the data for that as well.
Yeah, so I mean, again, just picking up on the local ceasefires, I mean, I think there's now a big movement towards talking about the local. And so I think someone was telling me the other day that I think in Agenda for Peace, like local arrangements was discussed like once, and in the more recent UN documents it's discussed like 200 times or something. So there's a movement in general away from these big elite peace processes to focusing on the local, and ceasefires form an important part of that. But I think there's just various different motivations and forms that these take. So sometimes they're very much these strategic arrangements, like Siri was saying. Other times they're civilians mobilising together as kind of peacemakers. So, for example, there's a project down the road at the LSC, which is looking specifically at the role of local agreements in Syria, and it's shown examples of cases where local communities have come together and paid an insurgent force to move out of their town and operate in a different types of area. And sometimes they can be based on just like a single road, other times on a whole town, or other times in a whole region. And so the best example of a kind of localised arrangement is the Nuba Mountains arrangement in Sudan, which was a fantastically negotiated ceasefire. And that kind of pivots into your second question, which is what makes ceasefires effective. And so the first thing I'd say is just the process by which they're agreed. So if there's a clear process where the parties are involved and have buy-in and the ability to agree the terms in a sustained period of negotiation, they just have more chance of working. If the parties aren't involved in the process, or it's negotiated very quickly, it's far less likely to work. I mean, implementing a preliminary ceasefire takes about 2 or 3 months, and so it requires a certain level of trust. And then, as I kind of alluded to a little bit with the preliminary ceasefires, monitoring makes a massive difference. So it's hard for us to be clear, is it the monitoring itself, or is it the fact that the parties have entered into a phase where they're willing to accept a monitoring mission? And distinguishing these two things is really difficult, but what we can definitely say is when there is monitoring, ceasefires last much more.
And does this local, as you said, local ceasefires, does it impact the national level at all? Is there a reverse sort of impact that you've noticed, or?
Well, we have a big project on this at the moment at ETH. We don't have any good. What it looks like from what we've looked at so far, and and this is definitely very preliminary, is that like things trickle down rather than up. So if you have some level of agreement at the national level, then you're more likely to see localized arrangements occurring. But there doesn't seem to be much evidence, and this isn't just to do with ceasefires but agreements more generally, that local agreements ever map onto anything higher. And so in a way this is a kind of pushback against the narrative from the UN and others at the moment, which is that, oh, if we build peace in all these local communities, then perhaps this will aggregate up to something. But actually when we look at the data and individual cases, a colleague of mine at ETH, Aled Dersma, is like halfway through a big project on this at the moment, and he finds almost no evidence of localised agreements ever scaling up to a national level agreement.
Brilliant. I'll open for Q&A. Ben, I know you've got your hands up.
I'm Ben Barry from the Institute. I had a very small walk on part in Bosnia with the British contingent in the UN. And I got some observations which sort of partially map onto your theory. What we saw quite early on in the war in Bosnia is what I call a lot of very local micro-tactical ceasefires driven by the needs of the warring parties, like exchanging bodies, ceasefires to collect the dead and wounded, also military and civilian prisoner exchanges, often negotiated at a local level, but where the UN came in to help guarantee the local cessation of hostilities, that certainly extended it. We also saw that as the UN came in 92, remembering that its mission was to protect the delivery of humanitarian aid, a very narrow mission that expanded. There was a lot of enterprising UN commanders who negotiated local ceasefires to get the aid backwards and forwards across the complicated front lines. The one big thing I think we saw in Bosnia that I didn't see in your research was not just a Christmas ceasefire, but a seasonal ceasefire. Now we're dealing with a country that was very agricultural, but during the heavy winters in the mountains, it became very convenient for 2 or 3 winters of the war to have a national ceasefire that was also had a bit of international endorsement. The final one was supposedly negotiated by ex-President Carter, and there was a sort of almost a strategic bet being raised every spring on how long it would take for the winter ceasefire to break down. So I do also wonder if in rural areas there's an economic link to the sort of political economy of the rural community and the rhythms, particularly of agriculture. But thank you for a presentation of exemplary clarity.
Thanks a lot. Can I respond to that?
Yes.
I mean, first of all, I'd love to know if you can remember any of the names of the UN commanders that we might be able to reach out to, because that would be really interesting. So it's really interesting you say that, because we actually find some really interesting temporal trends in the ceasefires that we couldn't explain particularly well. So, for example, there's a lot more ceasefires in like December and July than we find at any other point. And so there's one published paper that looks at this and argues that you get more ceasefires in the summer months, because when the UN closes down, lots of diplomats go around and undertake mediation work they hadn't before. But we hadn't thought about the idea of seasonal ceasefires, and so that's fantastic. And it does kind of relate to. It's slightly different, but in Ukraine we see lots of these localized ceasefire arrangements as well. That's very much based around agriculture and harvest seasons and the like. And so we will definitely look at. That's definitely something we can look at, and that's fascinating. Thanks a lot for highlighting that.
Gentleman over here.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Captain Carlos Delgado, Colombian Naval Attaché, and I have a couple comments.
Please.
But I have a question as well. In this room, there are 3 officers, Colombian officers, who has been involved in the ceasefire for a long time: Army, Police, and Navy. And first of all, the ceasefire comes directly from the political desires, at least in Colombia. Any ceasefire in my country has been made in local or rural areas. It's coming directly from the political level. That is the first thing. The second is I will add those categories that you were talking about, another one. Mm-hmm. What's the case in 2000 and something, the ceasefire with FARC was not any of those categories. Mm-hmm. with FARC. They argue for ceasefire, but during that time, during the military zone, they reinforced. They got involved more actively in illegal traffic of drugs, and after that period of time, we faced and we fought against a bigger and stronger organization. So that's completely different.
Yeah.
Was not season or was holiday, was just reinforced because they got involved stronger, or they got involved in the drug trafficking, and we had to reorganize our military forces to face against a stronger enemy. This is the second one. And the question is, do you think that ceasefire is motivated by any political will, or is based in the current situation of the conflict, or maybe some kind of motivations of the legal groups?
So, probably all of those above. I mean, you have ceasefires that would definitely come from like a political will and wish to end the conflict, or it could also be sort of the situation where the conflict is at the moment, where if you have an increase in violence, and either one or both parties come to a point where you really cannot take that kind of costs anymore. So it becomes a matter of how much can you take, and whether it's worth fighting further. But it can also be sort of, we're also trying to look into whether natural disasters could affect this. Sort of, is there if you have a natural disaster, does that make it more likely that you have a ceasefire, because that will change sort of the context that the conflict is fought in? So there could be several motivations for a ceasefire.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is that ceasefires are always strategic, and so parties will only ever use them if they expect to gain from them in some type of way. It's unlikely that after engaging in conflict for a period, anyone's going to seriously risk their position militarily by entering into an agreement. But actually, I'm going to use this because we wanted to talk about this before. We wanted to keep the presentation short, and the point you make about the FARC is really great. And so I'm just going to highlight exactly. So, because Colombia is super interesting. So like in the 90s and the 2000s, this was the kind of the assumption of how ceasefires had to work. And so that's like the conflict would go on, there'd be a pre-negotiation phase, the negotiations would start, a ceasefire would occur, there'd then be negotiations with a ceasefire, there'd then be a peace agreement, and then the agreement would be implemented. So this is what we've kind of called the sequential process. So you have a ceasefire before the negotiations, then you have the negotiations. In Colombia, this was really different, and it's for exactly the reason that you said, that 7 or 8 years prior to the Havana process, there had been a ceasefire. The FARC had benefited from that ceasefire, and so the government decided, we absolutely don't want to enter into a ceasefire that the FARC could profit from in the future. And correct me if I'm wrong. And so as a result of that, the parties agreed to fight as if they weren't negotiating, and negotiating as if they weren't fighting. And so they tried to separate the process a different way. And as a result, the negotiations began, and there was no ceasefire. So negotiations went on all the time, and instead there was a series of confidence-building measures and de-escalation points, but there was no ceasefire until right at the very end, and the ceasefire entered into effect on the same day as the peace agreement. And so effectively, in this period, they were talking and fighting at the same time. And this prevented the FARC from gaining any military advantage. And so now what we kind of see, and this is now kind of called the Colombia Model, now what we see is much more cases of this seeming to be happening. For example, in Yemen and Syria and other places, where negotiations are occurring in the absence of a ceasefire. And it looks like, and we don't know if this is the case, we're moving away from a model of ceasefires early in the process to a model where negotiations take place without ceasefire occurring.
The gentleman over here, then I'll come over here.
Thank you very much. My name is Jamie. I work with Crisis Action, an NGO, and I've spent a lot of the last 6 years working on Syria. So I'm interested in some of the stuff that's just been talked about, whether whether ceasefires could actually have a negative effect sometimes. I mean, the hope is that even if they're very, very small and they break down, they could contribute to a sort of a virtuous cycle whereby parties get used to compromising, putting down their weapons and so forth. The risk, as I think we've seen in some places in Syria, is that they can actually contribute to a vicious cycle, and it breeds distrust as it becomes eminently clear that some parties are manipulating them for political or military ends. Recognising that the data can't tell maybe the full story here, but does the data tell us, give us any clues as to which of those cycles is more likely to happen and why? Do we see, for example, sort of piecemeal ceasefires breaking down frequently and then leading to a big spike of violence, or is it more often the opposite can lead to a more consolidated peace process?
I'm going to take one more question.
It's an observation. Dudley Ankerson, I was advisor to President Santos for the 7 years of the peace process, and we took a decision at the very beginning to apply as much military pressure as possible to the FARC because of what had happened at Kagwan with the FARC using the ceasefire to rearm, etc. But this was very calibrated, and all the time we were measuring at what point we want to look for a local ceasefire for certain groups of the FARC, or bigger ceasefire. And the conclusion was, let's wait until right at the end, because once you embark upon the ceasefire, it has an implication for the demoralization of the state forces, and also for the demoralization of the FARC. So we were hoping that if you apply enough pressure, and then you introduce a ceasefire, then they're not going to want to fight anymore, because you want to be the last man to die. So it was very, very calibrated.
Can I go first? So just to link these 2 points together, actually, because they link together great. So thanks a lot for both the questions. So Jamie, two points. So first of all, is there kind of bad things that can come from ceasefire? So one of the interesting things that we see is that in countries in which there's multiple insurgencies going on, we find some preliminary evidence, and this is still preliminary, that ceasefires can be used in one part of the country in order to escalate the violence in other parts of the country. And we see this in Syria, and we also see it in Myanmar, the 2 cases where we find clear evidence of that, and we're looking at the extent to which that's a general kind of pattern. So that's one potential dark side of ceasefires. And then this isn't so much from the data yet, because we're yet to kind of get to this point of the analysis, but from interviewing and talking to people in the process, clearly when ceasefires break down, they can do more harm than good in terms of betraying the trust of the parties. And so entering into a ceasefire too early can be problematic. So if the parties aren't ready for it and the international community apply pressure to the parties to enter into an arrangement, you end up with this perverse situation where it's less costly for the parties to enter into an arrangement that they know they can break very quickly due to the fog of war. And so, UN Security Council resolutions calling for a ceasefire might push the parties into a ceasefire that they have no intention of breaking, and then when it breaks down, creating a ceasefire in the future then becomes more problematic. And so to link it to this other point, thanks a lot for sharing that. It's really interesting to hear, and it's if you have a ceasefire, you make yourself vulnerable to spoilers, because if you have a ceasefire and the parties commit to it, and then a spoiler wants to undermine the process, they can then go and break that ceasefire and use it to break down the whole process. And so from speaking to other people that were involved in the Colombia process, this was also, it seemed to me, one of the calculations that if we enter into this kind of agreement and then there's an incident and people are kind of killed, then it could lead to a breakdown of the process. And so instead, by resisting having a ceasefire and instead, and you guys can all correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm definitely not a Colombia expert, and so I'm a bit scared with you guys all just sitting there in the front looking at me like, whoa, careful what you say. But from my understanding of it is that the ceasefire wasn't used, but there was a series of scaled confidence building measures and de-escalation agreements in Colombia. So the parties took a number of other measures that served the same function that a preliminary ceasefire would normally have served in that type of context. And so I think if I'm rabbiting a bit now, but generally speaking, if you're going to have a successful negotiation, you need to protect the process in some way from things happening on the battlefield and undermining the process. And so sometimes it's too risky to have a ceasefire, and so instead thinking creatively about other de-escalation arrangements that you can have can serve that same function. And I think Colombia is just a fantastic example of thinking creatively about how you can do that.
I think the point is that you really expose yourself if you have a ceasefire. And there were several incidents which nearly led to a breakdown of the negotiations. And that was even without a ceasefire.
Yeah.
But they themselves nearly smacked. We had sort of emergency meetings on how we're going to handle this and so on. And so I think actually the Colombia Model is well worthwhile considering because of that.
Perfect, thank you.
Ollie Major from Rusi. You'll be glad to hear I'm going to take you a little bit away from Colombia. Not because it's not interesting, because I know very much about it. You mentioned two things about external intervention. One was about monitoring processes, and one was a fairly stark assessment that the presence of external forces reduces the likelihood of effective ceasefire. On the former, are you able to tell whether it is the fact of the monitoring processes being in place which gives credibility to the ceasefire and is therefore symptomatic of it going to last? Or is it the presence of effective forces which are able to assert those monitoring processes? I'm interested in your reflections on when that doesn't work, when you've got effective processes which don't work because they can't be executed. And a similar point really on the external involvement, I'd be interested to know whether you've been able to assess whether that is a symptom of a conflict which won't achieve a ceasefire or a factor in denying it. So is it, what I'm basically saying is, a conflict which has required external assistance, is that therefore a conflict which is never going to be amenable to ceasefire? Or is it the sheer presence of outsiders which stops them happening?
Gentleman over here.
Aminullah Habibi, just returned from Afghanistan. When you define ceasefire, still I'm not clear what do you mean by ceasefire, because if, for instance, there is a local agreement between two commanders, or as mentioned earlier that they just pause the war just to collect the bodies, or is it a ceasefire, or there is something deeper, that a political intention is behind that? And that process aims to the cessation of hostility, and then you can call that a ceasefire. In Afghanistan, in the past 40 years since the invasion of the Soviet Union, we just had ceasefire in the last Eid, or religious, Ramadan Eid, for 3 days. And that was kindly agreed between both two parties. But we haven't had any ceasefire, though locally we've had cessation of hostility that two commanders had, but we didn't call that ceasefire. So what do you mean by local ceasefire when you talk about it?
And I'm going to take one more, Tim, and then I'll come to you.
Can I just touches actually on the point Ollie made about external pressure. I was involved in the South Sudan peace, and hesitate to call it a peace agreement because it hasn't been agreed, but certainly the ceasefire at the beginning of 2014, and we, the international community, pushed very hard for there to be a ceasefire. These people were clearly not ready for it. They weren't in the psychological state. They didn't share the analysis of what was happening. And I've always thought about whether that was the right thing. In the textbooks, and as far as their textbooks, we seem to be told that an early ceasefire can be damaging. But the political reality was that we, as the external players, had to try to push these parties together and sign something. In fact, it was more than a ceasefire. It was a series of obligations to do various things. It lasted, I think, 6 hours. And in the next 3 years, 400,000 people died. So it was a great success. But my point is we would all do that again. And so from the point of view of the external player, the so-called international community, what are your thoughts about that? I mean, is there any sort of opinion you're forming about whether there are alternatives in cases when not only are the parties not ready to negotiate, but they're not, basically you have state failure and you have multiple, and you referred to this, multiple players pulling in different directions at the same time. But the pressure to do something coming from the external players is, I would argue, there's no alternative to it. So we're in a trap.
Yeah. 3 big questions. Do you want to go first? No, I'll take this
Yeah, so maybe just on so what is a ceasefire? And I guess we didn't really define it that well when we presented, but what we do in the data set is to anything where there is an agreement, written or oral, where they want to sustain violence, and it actually has a point in time. So not just sort of we should stop fighting at some point, but it actually has a specific point in time. We would call it a ceasefire. So that of course is a wide range of a lot of different things, and that's why we also try to code the various sort of the purposes and the type of actors, etc. as well. And we do want to at some point also code sort of this 3 types that Govinda was talking about, with cessation of hostility, preliminary and definite ceasefires as well, which is not there yet, but it will be. But we have a very broad sense of what ceasefires are.
Great. So, loads of points here, so I'll try and respond to them, and if I miss something, then just tell me if I've missed it. So, Ollie, first of all. So the first point, like external, like outsiders, and why is it that when there's external intervention, this makes ceasefires less likely? And so, if you look at the kind of conflict and the conflict management literature more generally, like first of all, more parties just make things more complicated. And so, just by having more veto players, instantly that makes things more challenging to arrange a ceasefire. But I think more so than that, when you have external parties who aren't suffering the costs of conflict, who have a significant amount of control and command and control over their kind of proxy forces, I think that's a serious impediment. And this comes from reflections with various people from the mediation support unit in the UN as well. I've been working with someone on a document looking at this, that during the Cold War, there was a series of procedures that were adopted by the international community of designing a negotiation and a mediation process to take into account that there was external forces involved, and different approaches were selected. So again, whether you sequenced this, so you first of all agreed things with the outside parties and then with the inside parties, or where everybody was in the table at the same time. And then this shifted in the 90s when the international environment changed, and we still operate with, and this is to be clear, this is an assertion rather than something backed up by clear quantitative research. But it appears to me that we're still designing peace processes in the same way in which we were in the 90s and the 2000s, even though actually in a lot of these conflicts we're back into a context that was more similar to the Cold War than it is to now. And so I think we need to think long and hard about, specifically with regards to ceasefires, how we design a peace process to take into account that in particular neighbouring parties or geopolitical actors are playing a decisive role in whether or not these are agreed or not. Secondly, with regards to monitoring, yes, we've done some because in statistics things work well when you have high numbers, and we have lots of ceasefires, but only 100 or so that have monitoring arrangements, and so it's hard to do anything that you can be super confident in. But we've done the most sophisticated techniques that are possible, and they show that there is an independent effect of monitoring as well. So in addition to the fact that clearly if the parties agree to monitoring, they're likely to be more favourable to ceasing hostilities than those that don't, we find that even if we take that into account in the best ways we can, the monitoring also has an independent effect. And so monitoring does appear to be a really important thing. Unfortunately, we then get down to such small numbers, it's hard to say what type of monitoring. But I was talking with a member of the UN standby force last week, and in the UN guidance on ceasefires that they're going to release at some point in the future, there's going to be a series of different ideal monitoring arrangements, and that's something that we're thinking about working on more, about trying to develop some clearer guidance on which type of monitoring works well from best practices. And Tim, with regards to the kind of the peace trap that you were talking about we have to do something. So Julian Hottinger, who's one of the main Swiss mediators who you're probably aware of, he describes that the biggest shift in the mediation world in the last 10, 15 years has been that as soon as the gunshots are fired, mediators get dispatched to the region, and pressure immediately starts being put on the parties to enter into arrangement. And that's kind of crazy, because the fact that violence has just begun means that it's very unlikely that they're going to be willing to enter into an agreement. And so we end up in this difficult situation whereby the international community have to do something, but it's very unlikely that it's ever going to work. And then you get these weird cases like Yemen, and like the Yemen ceasefire never should have worked. I mean, it was negotiated under, well, without being a complete expert, and from my understanding, it was negotiated in unideal conditions with a not particularly fantastic process, and the agreement is 2 pages long. And so everything that we found about ceasefire suggests that never should have worked. And it's kind of held and kind of worked. And so speaking to people from the UN, they're really surprised that has held as well as it can. And that does point to the need that sometimes it is good to do things. I would say, and this really comes back to the really interesting point from Colombia, that sometimes perhaps rather than pushing for full ceasefires, that when they break down it destroys trust, working instead on measures of de-escalation and confidence building short of a ceasefire that can serve a similar function, prevents you having that big loss if they don't work out as well as they can. And again, I think kind of using the Colombia example there, I think is potentially useful.
Gentleman here, then we'll go to Dia.
Already answered the question, actually.
Dia, go to you.
Hi, Dia, I'm from the Institute. Just to continue on the topic of Yemen, I take a slightly more pessimistic view of the UN's analysis. So, as with the with the Stockholm Agreement, you had redeployment of forces from the 3 ports in Hodeida province, but we still saw clashes taking place in that area. So, as you said, the agreement was 2 pages long, and one of the lines was there must be a ceasefire within the city of Hodeida. But when the forces moved 5 kilometers and 1 kilometer respectively for the Houthis and the Saudi-led coalition, it was just the fighting just moved 5 kilometers and 1 kilometer away as well. So my question is sort of twofold. When you have such a protracted conflict, and one that has over 30 front lines, and forces are thinking, okay, you're intensifying in this area, therefore we'll intensify in the area where the ceasefire is meant to take place. How has that translated in terms of broader peace agreements? Because if the Hodeida agreement the Stockholm agreement is considered a peace agreement or a confidence building measure for a broader peace settlement in Yemen, have you found in the data that if a ceasefire is not observed, a broader peace settlement can still be reached nonetheless?
So the short answer is that we haven't got to that yet. So we haven't had a chance yet to look at, in particular, failed agreements and how they have an effect. And this kind of also harks back to one of the points someone else made, that I think it would be really super interesting if we can distinguish some of those conditions in which ceasefires break down and then we don't see ceasefires for long periods afterwards, and those in which they break down and then they're replaced, because obviously it's just really complicated. And sometimes actually, so we have some other work where we're trying to think and conceptualize what success actually means in a ceasefire, because it might be that, so for example in the Stockholm Agreement in Yemen, it's definitely not been a successful ceasefire, but it's been more successful than we thought it was going to be. For example, in the South Sudan case, where it lasted for less than 12 hours, and that was kind of what most of us would have expected. And so, but in other cases, agreements can break down, but the structures and the institutions that are built and agreed then form the basis of the next agreement. And you see that if you actually read the written ceasefire agreements, you see lots of commonalities with in the Philippines, for example. The agreements were kind of built on, and as problems came up, they fixed the problems, and the next agreement was almost the same with additional provisions within it. And so you can sometimes see where there's clear learning throughout the process, and other times it breaks down. But that's my way of kind of saying these are all the possible ways, but we don't really have a clear answer yet.
Thank you. Gentleman there.
Hi, my name is Mark Latimer. I'm from an organisation which is actually called Ceasefire, but we don't actually work, we don't only work on ceasefires, we only work on protection of civilians. Both of you, I think, talked about successful ceasefires, but only in passing, and you rather tantalisingly, I saw it as a slide which said how to have a successful ceasefire or something, and then you quickly went over it. But it made me think that when we're talking about ceasefires, indeed just in this room over the last hour, the idea of what a success is was used in people had very different ideas or seemed to be thinking of very different things. For some people, success meant something that led to a peace agreement. In other formulations, you could think of a success simply meaning a cessation of hostilities which is sustained for a period. And then both, and I think in South Sudan and in Yemen, and this is particularly, I think, informed by UN mediators or international mediators, there's also this notion that it's not just about ceasing hostilities, it's about reducing the impact on the civilian population, which is not quite the same thing. So you've had this, for example, this rather more effective ceasefire in South Sudan over the last period, while depredations on civilians have continued, even if there hasn't been much party-on-party fighting. So I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about what you mean by success in ceasefires, and whether you get different outcomes. If what you're really about is something quite different, whether you're going for civilian protection, whether you're going simply for a cessation of hostilities, or whether you're really going all out for a peace agreement.
So I think you're kind of answering it yourself. There are various types of ceasefires which we have talked about, and they obviously have different goals. So if you are in a peace process and you have a ceasefire, the aim is to reduce the violence, to be able to reach a peace process. But then, of course, at what level is then success? Is it when there's no fighting? Is it when there's less fighting? I guess we haven't reached sort of a criteria of what success is. But then, of course, you have these other types of ceasefires which are related to humanitarian efforts, which then, of course, a success would be if you can have humanitarian aid delivered, or if you can, like in Yemen, have more control of the port in Hodeida. So I think it's because our data set includes so many different types of ceasefires, success will also be a very different measure in all of these. And that's something that we need to look more into.
Yeah, I mean, just to put it in the same words, a slightly different language, like it's really like success for who that you're talking about. So for one of the conflict parties, a successful ceasefire might be one in which they rearm, regroup, and then regain the conflict in a stronger sense. For the international community, it might be much more about protection of civilians, mandates in particular, if there's a kind of peacekeeping force or like on the ground. And so I think it's a really complicated issue. I mean, one of the things that we're definitely really keen to get some more clarity on over the next 2 or 3 years is how and in what way does ceasefires lead to eventual peace agreements, which is the kind of key quote. So for us, the key criterion from an international perspective, from an outsider's perspective, is the function that ceasefires play in this peace process. And preliminary agreements, that's pretty explicit, that when these are agreed, they're preliminary in the sense that they should be feeding into an ultimate peace process. So success there, I think, is much clearer. For cessation of hostility agreements, which is a much broader house of various different things, it's much less clear. But we have a kind of conceptual paper we're working on this question now, so if you're interested, I can kind of send it to you when we have something.
Brilliant. I'm going to have to bring this to an end because we can go on talking about ceasefires all day long. Can you join me in thanking both of our speakers for being here today and for your engaging conversation?